Disaster Artist is directed by James Franco, and it also stars James Franco with his brother Dave Franco, as well as Seth Rogen, Paul Scheer, and a ton of other cameos that you will probably recognize. The film recreates the real-life story behind the making of the infamous cult classic film The Room, as told by the book The Disaster Artist, which was co-written by Greg Sestero, who played Mark in The Room, and is played in this by Dave Franco. I was really curious about this project, firstly because I really love films that are about filmmaking, and just the subject matter itself really intrigued me. But what is abundantly clear after watching the film is that although James Franco is a perfectly adequate Tommy Wiseau, he's not a very good director, and he really has no clear idea as to how to tell the story. What he was clearly more interested in was essentially remaking The Room. And had they gone all out and made a shot-for-shot remake of The Room, maybe that would have made for a more interesting, weird little curious project. But as is, the film is very middle of the road and doesn't really amount to much. It wants to be a comedy, it fails. It wants to be a movie about filmmaking, about taking risks, and at that it also fails. It wants to be a film about friendship, and at that, it fails as well. The last act of this film is the grand premiere of the film The Room, so Tommy Wiseau is in the audience, all the cast and crew are there, and probably people that were invited. And as the movie slowly progresses, everybody just starts laughing. And they're not laughing with the movie, because it's not supposed to be a funny movie, they're laughing at the film. That could be your movie right there. How does an artist, quote unquote, or somebody that puts something out there, how do you, when you make something really personal, that's supposed to be dramatic, that is supposed to have a certain impact, not only does it not have that impact that was intended, but people are mocking it, people are laughing at you. There's a real struggle there that could have made for a far more interesting scene and a far more interesting film than what we get. But it's undercut within seconds. Tommy walks out and realizes he can milk this and goes, "Oh, I hope you like intentional bad movie, I make a comedy." And that just eliminates any thematical resonance that the film could have. And that's the film in a nutshell. A bunch of poorly written, mediocre scenes that serve as sort of a vanity project for Franco. And the big question is, why would I ever want to watch this film again, let's say, instead of The Room? Now, obviously the answer is, well, you should watch both. Well, if I don't want to watch both, I'm gonna rewatch The Room. That movie is so weird and crazy and alien and a once-in-a-generation thing, whereas The Disaster Artist is just incredibly average and middle of the road and looks like every other film I see every year. But in that way, despite itself, the film does illustrate a really interesting and key point, and that's why we gravitate to these weird, bad, schlocky movies. The Disaster Artist is a perfectly competently made film, but not much else, and that's the problem. It isn't special. The Room is special. It's not special in any of the ways it was supposed to be special, but nonetheless, it is a spectacularly weird, special film, and it will continue to be treasured for a very long time. And if you're interested in these ideas as to why we sort of love these bad films, and if a film is objectively sort of really bad, but brings a lot of joy to people, and people watch it a lot, and get a lot out of it, is it really that bad? A film that tackles these ideas in a far more interesting way is the documentary Best Worst Movie by Michael Paul Stevenson. He was one of the kids, he was the main kid in Troll 2, and like 20 years later he made a film about the phenomenon that is Troll 2. And that film really captures a lot of what The Disaster Artist could have, but really didn't. And there's also a lot of pleasure to be derived from seeing Claudio Fragasso, the director of Troll 2, who still believes he made a really important, really serious film. and misunderstood film, and really isn't in on the joke at all. And I figured that since I didn't really much care for The Disaster Artist, but I still love films about films, I'd give a list of 5 films that are about filmmaking that are far better than The Disaster Artist. Now, I didn't include Singing in the Rain because it's too obvious, and it should be very obvious because that movie's perfect. I also didn't include Ed Wood because I felt that movie's been talked about a lot recently within the context of The Disaster Artist coming out, but it's a wonderful film. I love that movie to bits. And so very quickly, I'm just going to rattle off these films very quickly, and I figured that for once I'm going to call for like audience participation. If we could get some films in the comments that you guys love, you know, so we get a full list going of great films about filmmaking, that would be cool. The first one is 8.5, Federico Fellini. You can't not put it in there. Maybe it's a little too obvious, but I felt I would lose a lot of street cred if I didn't put 8.5. It's not my favorite Fellini film. I still prefer La Dolce Vita, but, you know, you can't go wrong. Number 2 is Day for Night, directed by François Truffaut. Again, a classic. If you haven't seen it, jump on that. And if you haven't seen a lot of French films, if you haven't seen a lot of French New Wave films, I think Truffaut is a perfect way to get into that. He's very accessible, and I've seen probably the majority of his films by now, and I love every one of them, really. So, yeah, Day for Night. These aren't in any order, by the way. They're not like from best to worst or whatever. They're just films that I'm listing off. Number 3 is State and Maine by David Mamet. I feel David Mamet's a really underrated director. I mean, he is incredibly celebrated as a playwright. He's also a great screenwriter, wrote The Untouchables, wrote Ronin, wrote Glengarry Glen Ross. But as a director, people don't really talk about him that much, and I would really encourage people to see his filmography. I think he's done some tremendous work, and State and Maine's just a great satire on Hollywood. Really funny comedy, really sharply written. If I remember correctly, the film's about this Hollywood production setting up in this small town, and the main actor, played by Alec Baldwin, like fucks a 14-year-old girl, and that causes a problem, and he can't keep his dick in his pants. Considering the current state of what we are discovering about Hollywood, it's pretty sharp satire and very, very timely. Next one on the list is The Bad and the Beautiful. Vincente Minnelli, another classic. Kirk Douglas, man's a national treasure. Hopefully we won't find out that he was an asshole. And the last one on the list is Living in Oblivion by Tom DiCillo, which is incredibly fun. And if you've ever worked on a low-budget film, this one is extremely relatable. Great cast. Steve Buscemi as the director is great. I love Dermot Mulroney as the director of photography, maybe because since that's kind of more my background. And just weird that this guy never really went on to do much more after that. So for everybody who watched the video, thanks as always. Be sure to like and subscribe. And this is the last review I'm doing this year. I'll be back in January, probably around mid-January, to do a year-end review and talk about the best films of 2016. I really didn't want to rush it out. I feel that I can't, in good conscience, make a best of list without seeing the new Paul Thomas Anderson film. And it'll give me a chance to catch up on a lot of things that I missed. So we'll be back in the new year. And again, to everybody, thanks for watching. Thanks really to everybody that subscribes and watches these things, really. You know, we're not a lot out there, but it really means a lot to me, so thanks. And until next year, see ya.